I'm John Little of OmegaShock.com, and this is the Weekend ShockCast for Saturday, November 15th, 2014. There's a certain rhythm to the universe, and each part of the universe has its own distinct tempo. Each pulse and pattern rumbles and beats according to a cadence set by our great composer. We see it everywhere, yet we often fail to see it in ourselves and in the mass of people that we call civilization. So when Martin Armstrong, Nikolai Kondratiev, or Raymond Wheeler demonstrate that there is a cycle to human existence, we scoff at the idea. Why? Because it demonstrates a severe limitation to free will, and we don't like that, which is completely understandable, although foolish. Of course, my personal belief is that if the tool fits, use it. Now, this doesn't mean that we accept everything that such men say. They have captured an idea that makes sense and we should pay attention, but it's not an invitation to agree with everything that they say. Great men and women are as prone to error as anyone else. That's why we should always be guided by the Holy Spirit. So, what did we talk about this week? This week we talked about how the economic confidence model predicts that everything will fall apart financially in the fall of 2015. We looked at some of the foundations for that model and then had a look at the cycles of war and the fact that it appears to be turning next week. And we ended with a look at the intersection of the year of Shemitah and the economic cycle. So let's talk about that. On Monday, it was our last good summer, 2015. History runs in cycles. Life runs in cycles. Investments have cycles. Everything, in fact, runs according to some form of cycle. Anyone who says otherwise is a fool. In fact, fools have done an incredible amount of damage to investors by loudly proclaiming the end of cycles. There's always some idiot proclaiming that stocks will keep going up just before they crash. And once they crash, the same idiot will often be heard saying that they will never go up. You might say that there is a cycle to idiocy, too. Well, there's yet another cycle that you must pay particular attention to: government bonds. Ever since I began to wake up to how bad things really were in 2011, I've been trying to figure out when everything really falls apart. And every year I've been wondering if that year would be our last good one. In fact, just a couple months ago, Bix Weir and Harvey Organ went out on a limb and said that everything would fall apart by the end of 2014, a little over a month and a half from now. They still could be right, but Bix is already starting to edge back from this prediction. Were Bix and Harvey wrong to sound the alarm over what could happen over the coming months? No, I don't think so. Why? Because something really awful is coming, and if you jump too early, that's okay. Early jumpers will find themselves to have been ahead of the game. And with all that's coming, being ahead of the game is a really, really good idea. Now, there are some of you who want someone to give a date so that you can have as much fun as you can before an awful future hits. You might want to maximize your income. You might want to get as much profit out of your investments. You might want to get in one last family vacation. If so, you are a fool. And unfortunately, that's most of us. When dealing with an unimaginable future, it's better to be 5 years early than 5 minutes late. Seriously, folks, never play chicken with God. He rules the road, and he will run over you. So get your poop in a group and prepare for really bad times. Having said that, it is still instructive to make our best guess about when it will happen. And if you backed me into a corner and demanded when it all falls apart, I would say Martin Armstrong. Okay, that's not a date, that's a person. And a somewhat annoying person at that, since he has this knack for being always right about certain things. And one of the things that he seems to be right about is cycles in economic confidence. Years ago, he discovered that every economy in the world follows an 8.6-year cycle, from peak to peak or trough to trough. When an economy hits a top and starts down, that economy won't hit another top until 8.6 years later. He also noticed that these cycles weren't numbered in years or months, but days, 3,141 days. He developed a model to describe that observation and to help predict future turns in the economy. That model is called the Economic Confidence Model, or ECM. Martin has been uncannily accurate with his ECM, which is why I am paying attention to it. When it comes to when an economy turns direction, I listen to what Martin says, and I'm willing to extend my favorable view of his abilities to his analysis of other cycles. But when he gets into other areas unrelated to cycles, not so much. I find his analysis of cycles of war and internal conflict to be compelling, but he is dismissive about the idea of precious metals manipulation, which I find to be strange. However, I'm not interested in his views on gold or silver. I just want to know when the economic system collapses. Martin's answer is October 1st, 2015. The longer answer will include an interim bottom by October 28th, 2016, with a small recovery that will end on November 25th, 2017, and a final bottom will arrive by January 19th, 2020. I provide a picture of that graph, and you can see an earlier part of the graph that also models 1985 to 2011. I originally saw that graph in an article about the business cycle that Martin published in September 26, 1999. And that graph uncannily predicted ahead of time the rise and fall of our economies that we've seen so far. It's more than a little shocking to see such accuracy. In fact, I don't want to believe that we are so predictable, but apparently we are. Lord willing, I'll be able to discuss the ramifications of Martin Armstrong's economic confidence model over the next few days. But for now, just consider that the summer of 2015 to be the last good summer that any of us may ever have. On Wednesday, it was Doomsday in October 2015? Really? Yes, really. I know. It sounds crazy to think that something like the Economic Confidence Model, or ECM, could be so accurate. But it really does appear to be all that, and a bag of chips. The only problem is that we tend to ignore what we do not understand. If something doesn't make sense, it doesn't exist to us until we understand it. So let me give you a look at the really solid ideas that are the basis for the ECM, as well as giving you an example of someone discovering a principle at work before another someone came along and gave us the how. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter how it works. What matters is that you take steps to get out of the way of what is coming. As I said on Monday, everything runs according to some kind of cycle. By the way, sorry about no article yesterday. I also teach a Bible class on Tuesday, and I didn't have the time or energy to write. In fact, I can't think of very much that doesn't run according to some rhythm or cycle. And the exceptions that I can think of probably do run according to a cycle that I just can't see. That brings to mind something that you might not have heard of: Brownian motion. Botanist Robert Brown was looking at pollen grains under a microscope. They were in water and moving, but he couldn't predict or describe the reason why they moved through the water in the way that they did. It seemed random to him. That was 1827. Almost 100 years later, in 1905, Albert Einstein published a paper that was able to give a mathematical basis for this seemingly random process. To put it another way, a scientist who understood that the universe was rational was seeing something that didn't appear to be rational, and it took an exceptionally rational person, Einstein, to show us how it really was rational. I guess that you could call it an issue of faith. We needed to just have faith that there was a rational reason behind something that didn't look all that rational, until someone could come along and use math to show us how it worked. So, just like Robert Brown, we also have noticed that there seems to be a certain motion to an economy. It goes boom for a while and then bust, with a tremendous regularity. And it has taken an exceptionally rational person, like Martin Armstrong, to recognize the underlying mathematical nature to this rhythm, and It's pi. Yeah, I know, that's a really strange idea, but let's take a closer look. Martin Armstrong first came face to face with the idea of economic cycles as a young man when he realized that gold had been $162 an ounce in 1869, when he knew it to be $35 an ounce at that moment in time in the 1960s. He said, quote, "For the first time in my life, I was faced with a paradox that seemed to conflict with traditional concepts. How could gold be $162 in 1869 and yet be worth only $35 in the 1960s? Surely inflation was supposed to be linear. If a dollar was a lot of money in 1869, this meant that adjusted for inflation, gold must have been the equivalent of several $1,000s. If value was not linear, then was anything linear?" Close quote. He dove into the library, researching everything that he could find on the possibility of cycles in business and economics. He read about the Kondratiev wave, but there didn't seem to be enough behind it. Then Martin says, quote, "I didn't know how to go about such a quest to find if the business cycle was definable. Admittedly, I began with the very basic, naive approach of simply adding up all the financial panics between 1683 and 1907 and dividing 224 years by the number of panics, being 26, yielding 8.6 years. Well, this didn't seem to be very valid at first, but it did allow for a greater amount of data to be tested compared to merely 3 waves described by Kondratiev." Close quote. Martin then resolved to test his observation. Quote, "Using 1929.75 as a reference point, major and minor turning points could then be projected forward in time. For the most part, I merely observed and kept to myself this strange way of thinking. In 1976, one of those 8.6-year turning points was quickly approaching, or 1977.05. For the first time, I began to use this model, expecting a significant turn in the economy back toward inflation. My friends thought I was mad. Everyone was talking about how another Great Depression was coming. The stock market had crashed by 50%, and OPEC seemed to be undermining everything. I rolled the dice and stuck to it, and to my amazement, inflation exploded right on cue as gold rallied from $103 to $875 by January 1980. Close quote. Once Armstrong became convinced that he had found something that could help predict the turning points of the future, he began to put it to use. In the 1980s, he tried to warn the U.S. government that currency manipulation would cause problems, but they ignored him. And the crash of '87 came as he predicted it would, on October 19th, 1987. But even he doubted the accuracy of his own model. In fact, it took him a while to realize that the 8.6-year cycle that he was looking at was precisely pi times 1,000, or 3,141 days. I'm pulling all of this off of an old article that I found on the internet. Martin was writing this in 1999, in which he also said, quote, "The future that lies ahead will increasingly move ever greater towards intensity and volatility. Such periods have always brought not merely great booms and busts, but they too hold in the palm of their hand the thunderbolt of war. The economic future of Russia is one of such corruption and decay that it too will rise as the warlord who seeks to regain what he has lost. China too will eventually beat the drums of war as its economy worsens, and its leaders seek to hold the slippery reins of power. Such periods of economic strife will begin to grow in intensity, particularly following 2002.85 and moving into 2007.15. Only when economic chaos reaches a sudden state of eruption is it possible to see a successful revolution. The government was not prepared in Indonesia. However, unless complete shock takes place in China and Russia, it is far more likely that these two nations will not fall to internal revolution, but will seek to turn the economic tides against their neighbors. These are basic facts of history that cannot be denied. War is directly linked to the economic fate of mankind. Undermine the economy, and you will create the next Hitler." Close quote. I find it interesting that he was so accurate. Well, it gets better. In the same article, Martin offered up a graph that he produced 2 years previously. It charts 1985 to 2011, and you can see it in my article. That graph is phenomenally accurate, and I showed you this graph on Monday. You can read a copy of Martin's article on ContraHour.com, and I provide a link in the article. If you read the comments section of that post, you'll read this one by Joni on February 1st, 2007. Quote, "I heard Marty interviewed on the radio back in 1998. He was a guest on a stock market radio show. He was fascinating, and I heard him predict a turning point on July 20th, 1998, which was a few days away. I thought, oh, sure. I was skeptical. But sure enough, the turndown came, and I watched it slide for a week. Then I was convinced he was right on. I went to cash, like he advised, and didn't buy back in until October 1998, where he predicted a low turning point. It was like having an ace up your sleeve, and to witness it myself and profit was truly awesome. Then again, I eagerly listened to him again as a guest on the radio program and took notes on his prediction for the 2000 high and 2002 low. And I took notes thinking, this is crazy. How am I going to buy stocks if they're all going down for 2 years? I had never shorted. Well, let me tell you, when the top in 2000 came and stocks kept sliding, I learned how to short really fast and didn't cover until Marty's 2002 October-November low. It was like poetry in motion. He, in my mind, became my stock guru. Ha! He's a phenomenal genius. I will never second-guess him again. I heard him live on radio and witnessed it for myself. He had all kinds of turning points, weekly, monthly. It was very cool. I wish we had him back. And now we face the 2007 February 27 top turning point to the downside." Close quote. Not many months later, we had the financial crisis of 2007-2008. To get a better idea of Martin's motivations, he wrote this recently. Quote, "If it is possible to make people aware of the truth behind the curtain, then just maybe we can save the day for our children and ourselves. Because this is coming at us head-on at warp speed now. There will be a turning point coming in history. This is when the big shifts in political systems take place, like 1933 that saw Mao, Hitler, and FDR all come to power in 1 year." Close quote. I respect that a lot. Martin Armstrong has said that his economic confidence model is a global one. Each country will have their own model. And Martin has said that the complete model has 32,000 different variables. The best thing to do with something that complex is to follow the author of that model. So I recommend that you pay close attention to what Martin is saying and writing. You can do that at his website, armstrongeconomics.com, and click the blog section. And yes, I really do read and listen to what he has to say. On Thursday, it was another doomsday. The war cycle turns next week. A financial doomsday is bad. Losing your wealth and your livelihood is not something that anyone wants to experience. But a doomsday for war? That is far, far worse. A financial collapse could cause hardship, but a war is a far greater threat, especially since our enemies have nuclear weapons. Given the choice, most of us will choose hardship over death. Of course, we aren't being given the choice. We are going to have a war and a financial collapse. And in the same way that there is a cycle for financial collapse, there is a cycle for war. And according to Martin Armstrong, the war cycle turns up next week. Since I had written something about the financial cycle yesterday, I thought that writing about the cycle of war and conflict would be a good idea. And I knew that Martin Armstrong had also been doing work with the idea of war cycles. So I went to see if Martin Armstrong had anything to say recently about this. Sure enough, he had. It was in today's post. Beware the cycle of war turns back up next week. And you can find the link in my article. And this was his opening paragraph. Quote, "We have to be concerned that the cycle of war turns back up next week. NATO has reported that Russian troops have now invaded eastern Ukraine. In the Cycles of War report, we wrote that target will be November 19th and 20th, 2014, or 2014.8871, where we should see some escalation in activity. It appears this may be correct and on point. Caution should be advised next week." Close quote. And Martin goes on to talk about Russia's escalation toward the U.S., and how Obama has sown the seeds for World War III. Things are heating up between Pakistan and India, and there is unrest in Mexico. Mr. Armstrong also reminds us not to forget the riots that seem ready to take off in Ferguson, Missouri. It's all a part of the cycle of war. Martin Armstrong has written a special report on the subject of the cycles of war, and you can get it for $75 at the Cycles of War 2014 link that I include in my article. There's also a graph that Martin put together quite some time ago, and it illustrates the Wheeler Index of war. So if the cycle of war and political change is 25.049 years long, and if we need to get halfway through that cycle to actually see a more peaceful time return, a lot is going to happen between next week and April of 2027. I believe that one of those things will be the coming of Gog and Magog against Israel, and that will trigger Ezekiel's fire. The massive solar flare that I call Ezekiel's fire will devastate the world, and you do not want to be caught in that. And I am currently spending every bit of time that I have to document my understanding of that event in Ezekiel'sFire.com. Lord willing, it will be a top-to-bottom analysis of what will happen, when it will happen, and what you need to do. Once that massive solar flare hits, the world will go through a period of recovery, probably at least 7 years. And then the Antichrist will take over. What will come before Gog and Magog and Ezekiel's fire? Very good question. Russia and China might nuke the U.S., or America could fall in a downward spiral into complete collapse instead. Or both could happen. It looks like there will be a lot of death and destruction over the next 12 years, and I am not looking forward to it. On Friday, it was Shemitah and the economic cycle. Many have come to me and talked about how closely the economic confidence model, or ECM, correlates with what Jonathan Cahn says about the year of Shemitah. Also, both models indicate that there will be economic fireworks after the summer of 2015. Curiouser and curiouser. So I thought that I would add my own 2 cents to this issue and tell you what I think about this correlation. And yes, I do admit that there is a correlation. But it's probably not the correlation that you think. Also, please be careful. Judaism and Christianity do not mix. Consulting Talmud about such questions is wrong. Just to make everything clear, I have an absolutely profound love for the Jewish people, and even the Arab people. And God has a profound love for the Jewish people too. But I do not like how many Christians have been consulting Talmud to understand the Bible. I understand why Christians would want to do that. The Jews have been spending thousands of years trying to understand the Old Testament, just as we have, and the Jews are just so, smart about the whole thing. And when you have a love for the Jewish people, you tend to identify with them. But as much as I love the Jewish people, I also know that they have rejected Christ. And they have spent the last almost 2,000 years reinforcing that point. Even the Jewish people have understood this. Several years ago, when I was living in Israel, I heard one Jewish theologian remark, 95% of Judaism is the statement, "We are not Christian." And I completely understand that. Almost 2,000 years ago, Judaism and Christianity were remarkably similar. In fact, the only thing separating Judaism and Christianity was a person. Jesus Christ. Since the rabbis were dead set against the acceptance of Jesus, they decided to emphasize elements within Judaism that would protect their followers from becoming Christian. And when that wasn't enough, they added elements and concepts to keep Christianity at bay. Then when the Second Temple was destroyed, Judaism found itself further twisted with even more concepts and traditions. And all of that was codified in the Talmud. I believe that it is a sad thing to twist a religion and culture like that, but it is their right to do so, just as it is their right to choose to suffer for eternity in the life to come. Please understand that salvation is like being pregnant. Just as there is no such thing as being almost pregnant or kinda pregnant, there is no such thing as being kinda saved. To put it another way, God doesn't have nieces and nephews. God only has sons and daughters, and I hope and pray that you are counted as one. The rule for all Christians is this: anyone who does not acknowledge Jesus Christ as their Lord, Savior, and God is not saved. Period. And anyone who does not conform to that rule is Antichrist. Not the Antichrist, but little a Antichrist. And we were all Antichrist before we were saved. To say otherwise is to demonstrate how little we know about salvation. That's why I'm always mystified by the Anti-Zionists who use the Jewish people's hatred of Christ as an excuse to hate Israel. Such fools do not understand that it is a rule that those who are not Christian will hate Christ and his followers. And yes, I believe that everyone who doesn't understand this is a fool. Why? Well, this demonstrates such a colossal level of spiritual ignorance about the most basic tenet of Christian faith that it leads me to put a question mark over the idea of whether such a person is truly saved. And that is my definition of a fool. The alternative is to admit that you are colossally ignorant and uneducated about the principles of God. God promised to save the Jewish people in Israel one day, but until then they will be against what we believe. And that is how salvation works. To believe otherwise is to label yourself a fool or an ignoramus. Okay, I think that I've gotten off track a bit, so let me get to the main point. I haven't talked much about Shemitah because of the connection of Judaism, but that doesn't mean that there isn't something that is worth talking about, so let me do that. By the way, the other thing that I dislike about Shemitah is the spelling. It just rubs me wrong to see a Hebrew word misspelled like that. The proper spelling is Shmita, and it's pronounced like this, Shmi-ta. But since everyone spells the word as Shemita, I will spell it like that too. But just know that I will grumble and grind my teeth every time I do so. Okay, I'm getting off track yet again. So how does the year of Shemitah and the economic confidence model, or ECM, intersect? My answer? I believe that observing the year of Shemitah will short-circuit the ECM. Let me explain. First of all, the year of Shemitah is not a universal constant like pi or Planck's constant or the cosmological constant. The year of Shemitah is a law imposed upon us by God. But God did that for a reason. Here's what Jesus said about the Sabbath. Quote, "And he said unto them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath." Mark 2:27. The same goes for the year of Shemitah. It doesn't matter which year you start counting from, the seventh year is the year of Shemitah. The universe doesn't revolve around a 7-day or 7-year rhythm. It is we who need to live according to a 7-year rhythm. To put it another way, it is good for us to rest every 7th day and every 7th year, whichever day or year that you might choose. Otherwise, we fall apart at 8.6-year intervals, i.e., the ECM. Of course, no one has ever rested on the 7th year, not the Jews, not anyone, nor have we observed a 7th year for the release of debts, which is what Shemitah means. So we don't know what life would be like if we observed a year of Shemitah. But take a moment and think about what would happen if we released everyone's debts on the 7th year. Think about what would happen if we took a year off from work after 6 years. Think about what would happen if you didn't charge interest on debts. For one thing, you wouldn't have any people who were super rich. It would be difficult for anyone to take advantage of anyone else. There would be no fractional reserve banking to distort an economy. What Martin Armstrong did when he discovered the economic confidence model, or ECM, was discover an 8.6-year rhythm to human nature. For whatever reason, we human beings decide to take a part of our hard work and pitch it out the window after a little more than 8.5 years. Some obviously do it more than others, and some sectors of our economy do it more than other sectors. But that doesn't change the fact that, as a group, we tend to destroy a large part of our productivity every 3,141 days. Could it be that there is something inside of us that desperately needs a sabbatical for a year after 6 years of hard work? I think so. Just as God gave us the Sabbath to rest for our good and not His, God also gave us a Sabbath year for our good. And I believe that we, as a society, are most vulnerable to the 8.6-year cycle described in the ECM because we do not observe the 7th year of release and rest. So that is how I see the connection between the Shemitah and the economic confidence model. I truly hope that you'll be ready for this. That's a link. There's not much time left. A prudent man foreseeth the evil and hideth himself, but the simple pass on and are punished. Proverbs 22:3. This has been the Weekend ShockCast for Saturday, November 15th, 2014. I'm John Little of OmegaShock.com, and I hope you have a good weekend.